So good morning, everyone. Good morning from Geneva. We start this webinar on my topic, which I have given you, which is patents and pharmaceuticals. I don't know if anyone wants to say something before this, or shall I begin? In any case, I don't think we can communicate two ways. So let me start with a disclaimer. I am a staff member of the WTO, but this presentation is made in my personal capacity. It's for academic and learning purposes only. So nothing in this presentation should be attributed to the WTO Secretariat or to WTO members, individually or collectively. And this presentation is also without prejudice to members' rights and obligations. I also have some caveats on the topic that I'm presenting. This is only about pharmaceuticals. We are not here talking about other health technologies such as medical devices. I may touch upon gene therapies, which is kind of got the same controversial issues as access to medicines. And this is not about intellectual property in general, but really only about patents. There are some issues I might discuss with respect to other forms of market exclusivity, such as regulatory exclusivities, like test data protection, where we have similar issues. So the big question that I'm going to touch upon today is how to reconcile incentives for innovation in the pharmaceutical sector with access to medicines and related technologies, like I said, gene therapies and so on. So to begin with, the introduction, very briefly, is about why do we need intellectual property in the first place, or patents in the first place? Why can we not do away with patents and thereby get rid of the problem of obstruction or obstacles to access to medicines? Well, as economists will tell us, knowledge is really like a public good, and new useful knowledge incorporated in innovative pharmaceuticals, for example, is the same. It's like a public good, and therefore, if there are no legal barriers to entry, there could be chronic underinvestment in the creation of such knowledge, and markets left to themselves would fail to produce optimal or socially optimal quantities of knowledge. Now, I am not going into whether markets today function in an optimal way, but in the absence of such legal barriers to entry, that is the case that economists would say that there would be chronic underinvestment in the creation of new knowledge. In the case of pharmaceuticals, there are other problems. There are long product development times. There's necessarily a stringent regulatory burden, and there is a relatively high risk of failure, which is connected, of course, with regulation. The stricter the regulation, the more chance that the innovative pharmaceutical, which is going through clinical trials, for example, will fail at some stage, whether it is phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3, or even after it is launched, which is called phase 4 in clinical trials. So then all the investment that has been made, particularly if the product gets withdrawn from a later stage of clinical trials, such as phase 3 or even after launch, the more money the company loses. So there is a relatively high risk of failure in this particular sector compared to other technologies, for instance, electronics and so on, where there isn't such a high regulatory burden. So that's the economic theory of why we need patent protection in order to generate innovative pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry, as I said, is peculiar. It has some characteristics which differentiate it from other sectors of industry. One is, it is unusually highly dependent on patents in this current market model of producing innovative medicines. And this we know actually from empirical studies that have been conducted, multi-sectoral surveys that have been conducted in developed countries mostly, but also in many other countries more recently. So this started in the UK with the Taylor and Silverstone study, 1973, and in several surveys that have been conducted in the US, for instance, Edwin Mansfield in 1986, Rick Levin and others in 1987, Wes Cohen and others, the Carnegie Mellon survey in the year 2000. And all these multi-sectoral studies confirm the unique importance of market exclusivity or patent protection for just a few sectors in industry. And this includes pharmaceuticals, the other sectors being fine chemicals and biotechnology, etc. So there are very few industrial sectors that are so uniquely dependent on patents in order to generate innovation. The second characteristic of the pharmaceutical industry, which makes it different from other sectors of industry, is that it is highly regulated. And this is necessarily so. So this need for regulatory approvals before a medicine can be marketed really covers a number of jurisdictions, almost most jurisdictions, I would say, other than those that depend on regulatory approvals given in one or the other leading a market. This process also requires disclosure of proprietary information, which also makes it important to actually protect the proprietary information. So the characteristic of very heavy regulation is one of the key aspects of the pharmaceutical industry. The other aspect is at the time of marketing or after marketing in some cases. There is price regulation in many economies, either direct or indirect price controls. And we'll talk about price controls a little later, but there are several ways in which there are restrictions on prices. Now, I'm not saying this happens everywhere, but this does happen in many economies around the world. The third characteristic, which is very specific to pharmaceuticals, is that for prescription drugs in particular, there are intermediaries, which makes it a difficult market because in most cases, there isn't direct marketing to patients. So you have to go through intermediaries, whether these are physicians who have to give you a prescription or pharmacists. And I know that in a country like India, you may not necessarily need a prescription, but you need to consult the pharmacist. So this principal agent problem is something which doesn't necessarily exist in many other industrial sectors. And the reason why this is important is that since the doctors or the pharmacists really are not the ones paying the amount, there's a little less price sensitivity in the choice of products. So it is not as competitive because of this problem of having intermediaries. The fourth aspect of the pharmaceutical sector, which is unique, is that it does have relatively high levels of R&D combined with relatively high risks of failure. We spoke about the clinical trials, failure in phase 1 of the clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3, or even post-marketing, which makes it a bit risky. Now, other products could bomb in the market, so to speak. That is, they are not successful in the market and therefore have to be withdrawn. And that there is a risk of that if your product is not good enough. But here, there is another problem, which is the regulatory, where you are forced to actually withdraw your product from the market or before it is even launched. So there are costs that are incurred before the product is launched. The fifth aspect is the very peculiar history of the modern pharmaceutical industry, which had a very unusual business model compared to other sectors, which in the past, and this is changing a bit now, but it is still largely characterized by exclusive production by the innovative firms without really licensing widely to others. This wasn't always so. So when I say modern pharmaceutical industry, I mean the industry that was really launched with products such as antibiotics, etc., which was, let's say, in the 1940s and 50s. Initially, there was actually wide-scale licensing. That was the norm, particularly in the United States, where most licensing, most of the leading pharma companies were licensing to others. Then how did they actually differentiate the products from their licensees? Through trademarks. And that was really the only way they would differentiate their products. Even where there were patents, there was wide-scale licensing. And this then changed very quickly with the objective of making more money to exclusive production without licensing to others. Now, why is it that you couldn't make the same profit by actually charging very high royalty rates? Because if you were to do that, you would really have to charge royalty rates which could be like 80% or more, which in those days and even today would have been a scandal. And this we get from the very interesting work that Peter Temin has done way back in 1979. And there have been others who have talked about this in seminal articles written in the past on the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in the US. The sixth aspect, I would say, of the pharmaceutical sector is there are known risks of loss of exclusivity because as soon as patents expire, generics can come in. And so that's a known risk. But there are also several unknown risks, but the risks are there nevertheless during the patent term of patent invalidation, which is increasingly a problem with the new processes that have been put into place, particularly in the United States. But there are also competition law cases that could arise or compulsory licensing, which is certainly permitted. And it is a risk to innovative pharmaceutical companies, originator companies. Now, a lot of people say that the pharmaceutical industry is among the most profitable, despite all of this, despite the heavy levels of R&D or the high risk of failure. It is actually one of the most profitable sectors of industry. And it turns out, at least the recent statistics in 2018, there were only 5 US pharmaceutical companies among the 100 most profitable in the Fortune 500 companies. And this I got from fortune.com. You can check it out yourself. And in another source of these statistics, which is Statista.com, you can check that out. In the 50 most profitable companies worldwide, there were only 2 pharmaceutical companies. Nevertheless, it is true that once a medicine enters the market and becomes a blockbuster, the same word as used for Hollywood films or Bollywood films, and the profit margins could be high. They could be in the range of 25% or even 30% or more. And this we get also from some of the statistics that are freely available online for pharma and biotech companies. But one thing to be noted is that most originator companies depend on very few products to actually build up their revenue base or their profit base. For instance, yesterday's Financial Times carried a story about AbbVie and its market results, its annual results. And From that, we learn that 2/3 of AbbVie sales in 2018 came from one product, which is Humira, their best-selling product. Despite the fact that, of course, patents have recently expired in the European Union and they are facing competition in the European Union. So in the future, that is going to be a problem for AbbVie unless they have other products, which they do, which replace this. So every R&D originator company is like sitting on something like a three-legged stool, which is keeping them stable. And if one of those legs, which is a product, faces patent expiry, then another leg has to come to replace it to kind of make the balance for the company. This is why pharmaceutical companies are relatively more interested or paranoid, you could say, about patent protection. And from the profits that are made, a large proportion is spent on keeping the cycle going of R&D, either through in-house R&D, which, as I said, is increasingly changing. It's becoming acquisition of companies that have done the R&D and have potentially profitable pipelines. But nevertheless, to keep the business model going, they have to keep this circle, virtuous circle going of having more products which keep the stool stable, so to speak. Now I will move on to the statistics. Really, is it true that the R&D by the pharmaceutical sector is higher than in any other sector? No, that's not true. In recent years, and I'm looking just at data that I got from the internet, where we find the automotive sector and the electronic sector is really investing a lot more in absolute terms in billions of dollars, and also in percentage terms compared to all sectors put together. So just automotive sector would be roughly 20%, and electronics another 30% or so of total R&D invested in worldwide figures. Where does pharmaceuticals figures? Well, it's one of the high investment sectors. It's in the range, and this is the recent statistics, it's in the range of about 13% or so, according to this website that I looked at. But one thing is true, that where is this R&D investment taking place? And there, geographically, it's really predominantly in the United States. So how do we know this? Well, if you say that everything, all R&D investment results in patents, whether these patents are good or bad is another matter. But if it results in patent grants, and if you look at where are patents being granted in respect to pharmaceuticals, you will see from WIPO statistics again, publicly available, that it's mostly in the United States. What does this mean? That the first inventor's address comes from the US. Now, these might be Swiss companies, they might be UK companies, but if the first inventor is filing first in the United States from an R&D facility in the US, it is treated as the US invention. And who are the biggest players in the pharmaceutical sector? Which companies? Are they mostly US? Well, many of them are US. Pfizer tops the list, and then you have Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Gilead Sciences, AbbVie, Amgen, and so on. These are US companies. But you also have Swiss companies, Novartis, Roche in this list, a French company, Sanofi, and so on. So, and a UK company, GlaxoSmithKline. So these are the headquarters of these companies. Now, they could be doing research and filing patents from the United States or somewhere else, but we see that the US dominates. One thing that I would like to say is, if you look at the more recent statistics of patent grants, patent filing, whichever you want to look at in the pharmaceutical sector, you see, and particularly if you take all health technologies put together, which is pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and medical technology, which is defined in the PCT, on the PCT website, you see that China is rapidly catching up. And this is particularly true in biotechnology. Now let's come to the effect of patents on prices, which is the issue that everyone is most concerned with. I would say that patent or no patent is not actually the main distinguishing factor to actually check on whether there's going to be an effect on prices. It really depends on how patents are exercised. As I told you, if, as in the past, patents were widely licensed, it has the same effect on competition as not having a patent at all. And this we know from an example that Peter Temin gives us of penicillin, which was not patented, and streptomycin, which was patented but widely licensed. And the rates at which prices declined in the initial years after introduction in the United States were more or less the same. So it's not patent or no patent, but how patent rights are exercised. If it's a restrictive way, a single supplier in the world, no matter whether there's a patent in that country or not, if there is only one seller in the market, then effectively they have some market power in that particular market. That's one of the factors that actually leads to high prices. The other factor is on price is, are there substitutes available and how close are these substitutes? So if you have substitute medicine to treat the same disease condition, what I would call inter-new molecular entity competition, that is one thing which could reduce prices. And of course, what is more effective is if you have competition within the same molecule, which is intra-new molecular entity competition, which actually they are perfect substitutes, and therefore the competition is more effective. The other thing about patents and prices to remember is nominal patent terms, which is 20 years from the date of filing according to the TRIPS agreement, is not the same as what are the market exclusivity periods which are enjoyed by medicines in different markets. On an average in the US market, it is said to be 8 to 12 years. And a more recent study, which was done and published in MIT Press journals, which I got from the website again, shows that the mean market exclusivity period could be 13.5 years, that is 13 and a half years, for top-selling drugs. Now, why do we distinguish between top-selling drugs and those that don't sell so well? Because generics are keen to enter markets that are profitable, and therefore they go in and try to knock down patents and try to litigate patents in the top-selling drugs. And if they can challenge those patents, then they can enter the market. And there are incentives in the United States in particular to allow for such patent invalidation. So what if you have an exclusive product, a product which is unique in treating a disease condition? Can you do anything at all about containing prices for such products? As a single supplier, it's the only product that is important for treating a particular disease condition. Do you have to still just wait for patent expiry, or is there something you can do still to contain prices within the patent term? And there are policies that impact on prices and that are permitted under international law, which include price controls. We talked about price controls, and let me tell you a little bit more detail. The kind of price controls in the past that India had were cost plus price controls, where you said, okay, let's allow cost plus 100%, 200% over cost, so that we give a reasonable profit margin to the company that is producing the medicine. This is really very difficult to do when there is a single supplier, because you really can't determine the costs, particularly when production is taking place outside of your territory. So then what else can you do? Well, you can have reference pricing, which is this particular company is selling in different markets around the world, or his licensee, its licensee is selling the same product in different parts of the world during the patent term. And you can check whether prices are being, whether the price sold in your country is okay compared to the average price being sold in other countries of similar levels of income and development, let's say, which is the kind of thing that Canada does on patented medicines. Not necessarily very effective if the originator company decides to price equally high in all reference markets. So that is a problem. What about monopsonies? Can you have a single buyer model, for instance, where the government is actually listing these prices for reimbursement purposes through the national health system or whatever it is, and there is a monopsony, there is a single buyer who can greatly influence the negotiations, and it's an important market. If it's a very small market, it won't work. So if it's an important market, you have this kind of negotiating power where you can bargain. You do a health technology assessment. You're trying to find out the value of the product, which is of the medicine, compared to other medicines which treat the same disease condition, and then settle on a particular price for the market. However, as we all know, and as I've told you already, competition is really very good. And you have the inter-NME competition, the inter-new molecular entity competition, which may not be as effective, but could be effective if this particular medicine is not particularly advantageous or doesn't have unique advantages. But what we are really aiming for is intra-new molecular entity competition and high volumes within the patent term. Can you still do that? Well, there is one policy instrument, which is compulsory licenses, which has been advocated as being one of those that can actually reduce prices a lot if you have this intra-molecular entity competition. Now, this has been studied, and one of the questions that economists have asked is, how does this affect future R&D? And Taylor and Silverstone, the same set of economists that I talked about, 1973 UK, they said, yes, there would be, if there was wide-scale compulsory licensing in the UK, this was a study for the UK, 1973, they said this would actually mean that pharmaceutical companies would resort more to trade secrets instead of patents to avoid compulsory licensing. And this would be a loss to society, and there would also be reduced efforts on R&D. However, Mike Scherer, who did a empirical study in 1977 in the US market, said that compulsory license decrees, which were really based on antitrust legislation, did not reduce R&D relative to sales compared to other firms of similar size and product mix. I would say compulsory licensing is allowed, but we need to look at these policies a little bit differently to see how they would work and whether they would work at all in certain markets. And let me just tell you what I think are the conditions for compulsory licenses to work effectively. Number one, the product or the technology must be copyable. What do I mean by copyable? Well, it must be easy to copy technically, cheap to reverse engineer without the cooperation of the right holder in that particular jurisdiction where the compulsory license is being issued for local production. Because the right owner is not going to cooperate in making the compulsory license work. So there should be little or no tacit knowledge. There should be no complex technologies, depending, of course, on the country, because the levels of skills and infrastructure differ from country to country. So what is copyable in one jurisdiction may differ from what is copyable in another jurisdiction. India, for instance, there would be fewer barriers, let's say, because it has a well-developed generic drug industry and so on. So that is one condition. The second is, you don't want the originator to be well established, because here I'm going to talk about trademarks. The first mover advantage is extremely important in the pharmaceutical sector. And this is based on studies done in the United States, no doubt. But because we have the intermediary problem, the first mover advantage is important and brand loyalty is important. And so the compulsory license should be launched as quickly as possible post-launch of the originator in order to ensure there is no entrenching first mover advantage. The third condition is the applicants must, of course, have the financial and technical capacity, not just in general, the country has the capacity, but the applicant for the compulsory license must have the financial and technical capacity to not only reverse engineer the product, to market the product, particularly to intermediaries such as doctors and pharmacists, but also to engage in legal battles where they arise. Fourthly, the country must have the administrative capacity, the legal skills, the judicial skills to effectively run a compulsory licensing system to deal with these issues in courts of law, for instance, when these are challenged, but also the political strength or the economic strength to face these issues when they arise in a bilateral context or a multilateral context or a plurilateral context. But where such conditions exist, would a compulsory license work to reduce prices? Yes, definitely. It would bring down prices. There's no question about that. That is just plain economics. And Canada was the one country that used compulsory licenses extensively in the 1980s, successfully for pharmaceuticals with a very low rate of royalty, and that was automatically granted at about 4%. Compulsory licenses do have a disadvantage in the sense that if you want to use it as the solution or the only solution to reduce prices during the patent term, they may not necessarily work, as we have seen, because of issues of real world. Can we depend on something else other than compulsory licensing? Well, you have parallel imports. But if you happen to be in a country like India, which is already having some of the lowest prices in the world, are you really going to benefit if you allow for parallel imports? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to see in the future when patented medicines become an increasing proportion of the market for prescription drugs in India. Hasn't happened as yet because of certain provisions of the amended patent law, which allowed for existing manufacturers to continue to produce products even though they were patented in India subsequently, medicines that were patented because of not knowing whether these were in the mailbox or not. So that's a transitional phase which will soon disappear, and then we will have to see whether this is really going to affect India and what are the solutions that India can find. Now, a preferred option by many economists is differential pricing. Differential pricing again has to work only if there are certain conditions. Now, this is preferred by economists because they say, well, if you have a monopoly or any kind of market power, then why you would actually increase profits if you priced according to the ability to pay in different markets. So the conditions are, yes, the seller must have some control over price, which is a degree of market power. The higher the degree of market power, the better control over price the seller has. The seller must be able to identify and segregate the consumers according to their price sensitivities or elasticities of demand. And the third condition is that the opportunities for resale or influence of price from low price markets to high price markets must be constrained. Market segmentation, but more than market segmentation, no direct or indirect influence on price, which is the difficult issue. Because once the originator companies view that there would be actually an indirect influence on price, if they start selling very low in some markets, there would be a demand for the same price in other markets, then there is no way differential pricing is going to work, which is the reason why there's quite little differential pricing actually going on. But are there ways in which you can actually fulfill market segmentation? Well, in the medicines field, it's more or less automatic. And we saw that after the Lexmark decision in the US Supreme Court had there was anticipation that maybe prices of medicines would now be subject to parallel imports. It didn't happen because of regulatory controls. So the labeling and packaging is also regulated. Where medicines are produced are regulated. You can't just simply import, even if it's an identical product by an identical company, the same originator company in a different market. Medicine markets are actually very tightly segmented. And however, there is this policy impact of the indirect effect on prices. Let me now come to my last two points that I'm going to make. One is about changing business models. The pharmaceutical sector is finding that in-house R&D is getting harder to do. All the risk is taken by one company, even though all the profits come to that company. But if the product fails, then all that money is down the drain. So they would like to share the risk, distribute the risk, as well as share profits. And so there is increasing multi-partner collaborations going on. There is also mergers and acquisitions, where acquisitions in particular of small enterprises which are doing the research and where they have potentially profitable pipelines, they're being purchased. This is increasingly becoming important way of getting to new innovative products. The other thing that is changing for the pharmaceutical sector is pricing. They are facing increasingly higher or closer scrutiny, particularly in their bread and butter markets, which is rich country markets, where people are looking for value for money. There are budget constraints, and the newer medicines, particularly in oncology and other kinds of gene therapy, they are getting more complex, they're getting extremely expensive, and so there's closer scrutiny. They are facing closer scrutiny. So they necessarily have to respond to that. One of the ways that countries have responded in the past to the same kind of scrutiny, and this is more to do with poorer country markets, has been voluntary licensing. So voluntary licensing is extremely important for the originator companies because, one, they can choose the competition, which is how they do it, and second, they can deter further entrants after patent expiry. So they know who's going to enter the market after patent expiry. They kind of have a better feel for that in all their markets around the world. And the third is, of course, they can counter the criticism on access and affordability. And the medicines patent pool is one way that originator companies engage in voluntary licensing, but they also go bilateral and they do their own voluntary licensing. But however, I don't want to overestimate this pathway, because it is still very limited. It's confined to only certain disease conditions, HIV, AIDS, hepatitis C, and perhaps now more recently TB. And so we can't really overestimate that. But it's a way to go. If it works, then more companies would like to go that way, that route. However, it does take away some of their profits because, as I said, you can't actually charge very huge royalties in such cases, which is going to hit the bottom line in the end. How is all this linked to the WTO? Most of you are educated in patents and public health and in patents and pharmaceuticals in general, and I don't have to tell you this, but I'll just point out that the Doha Declaration, of course, was very important. And one sentence really stands out to kind of tell us what is this essence, the essential dilemma here. When trade ministers recognize that intellectual property rights are important for the development of new medicines, which is absolutely true, at the same time, they also recognized in the same paragraph that there is a concern about the effects of intellectual property on prices. This about sums up the dilemma on patents and pharmaceuticals. So the Doha Declaration, of course, allowed and emphasized the full use of TRIPS flexibilities, such as parallel imports and compulsory licensing, which is perfectly legal to do under international law, under WTO law in particular. And in addition, we have the TRIPS amendment on special compulsory licensing, which allows for full exports of production of pharmaceutical products in order to supply other countries that have insufficient manufacturing capacities so that they can get generic products even during the patent term at a considerably lower price. I'll end only with one question because I would like to leave time, of course, for discussion, and I've already run over time. The financing of R&D. How much does R&D cost? We really have few reliable estimates, I would say. But we can all agree on one thing, that there isn't a waiting line, really, a queue to enter this R&D, pharmaceutical R&D sector. In fact, people are quitting in terms of mergers, acquisitions. They're kind of putting their pipelines together, and it's getting more risky. So people have come out with different ways of doing it. Why leave it to the market? Why not have non-market or market-related incentives, but non-patent or non-exclusivity related, not non-market exclusivity related incentives? And these are worth exploring, definitely. We need to explore these options and make them workable, because so far we have few takers for the kind of prize proposals or R&D treaty proposals. There's a lot of skepticism about whether these could work or not. However, there is a need for this. We need to think about how we can make these work. Just like we need to think about how we can make differential pricing work. Can we have an agreement which will somehow make companies more comfortable with the idea of differential pricing? That's another issue that we can keep thinking about and seeing how it will work. We need to really see what is the effect of these proposals on invention, because we don't want to stop the innovation from taking place, and we want to continue with the development of new medicines. At the same time, we need to think about how we can make these affordable during the patent term. Thank you very much for your attention, and now we're open to questions. Sure, how we can, I can hear the questions, or do I just have to look at it? This does take time. I'm unable to see any questions. Okay, there's one question. Okay, one, Nagraj Lanka. Due to welfare policies, oh my God, there are many questions. Due to welfare policies of governments in markets like India, will MNC stop? And this, I don't know where it goes after that. The US has come out with a 301 report yesterday questioning India's compulsory licensing provisions, that it may be a threat. How would WTO look at it? Would it stop MNCs from importing to India? Hi, what kind of model would you advocate for India? Okay, there are lots of questions. Let me just go up and check. So this 301 report questioning India's compulsory licensing provisions, I haven't seen the report. By the way, I should tell you that WTO, there is no such thing as a WTO view on anything. Members have views. And the members, if they agree by consensus, then it's a WTO view. Otherwise, the Secretariat has no views, and individual members' views are different, of course. So we don't have a one view. And would MNCs stop, importing into India? I'm not sure I understand the question. Would they stop importing? I mean, companies are obviously going to do what is more profitable for them, whether it is importing or locally producing. Whatever is more profitable, that's what they will do. And what kind of model would you advocate for India? No, frankly, we need to see how India is going to function with respect to how prices are going to really behave in a post-TRIPS world. We still don't have a full impact because of Section 11A of the Indian Patent Law. When the Act was amended, they inserted Section 11A, which allowed generic manufacturers who had already made preparations on certain products, which were subsequently patented, to continue to actually produce and market to the extent that they'd already made investments and so on. So this kind of exception was allowed in India, and that was in the law which came into effect from January 2005. That is going to work itself out. So over the years, I mean, by, let's say, certainly, let's say by 2020 or 2024, the last of such exceptions would have been exhausted. And that is when we will know the full effect, full impact of the TRIPS agreement and the patent law changes on the pharmaceutical sector. So far, and this is a study which has been done by a group of economists, including some people working in the World Bank. It's an NBR paper. I think they've published it subsequently elsewhere, which clearly shows that there's really very little price impact of the introduction of product patents. And as I said, the cause of that is really Section 11A. So Meghna is asking me, is it a good idea to correlate patent value or valuation with price of drug? I mean, when I spoke about value, I spoke about HTA, which is the Health Technology Assessment. This is an assessment that is carried out by in many jurisdictions. UK, for example, where NICE makes such assessments, or Australia or New Zealand, or Korea for that matter. So there are a number of jurisdictions which actually look at how to price the product and at what price to allow the product to enter their markets through the reimbursement systems. And I certainly think if India, for instance, were to have such a reimbursement system or direct payment system, any single payer or any single buyer system should actually use its monopsony power to negotiate prices with the originator companies on their patented innovative medicines. So Satish Kumar is asking me, what's your view on acquisition of pharma companies to avoid market competition and to maintain monopoly? So as I said, this acquisition that is going on, which is an increasing phenomena, as you know, as you have noted, this is something that is going on because pipelines are drying. So they're looking for companies that have promising products in their pipeline in order to continue to keep the three-legged stool, which I talked about, stable. I mean, this is just a metaphor. I mean, it could be four legs or 5 legs. But basically, if one of the legs falls off, they need to find another to replace it in order to keep the company bottom line stable. So this is what companies do in a market-based system. So R is asking me, my question relates to the fact that steeply priced patented drugs are available in India, but out of access for most people, especially those below the poverty line. Now, my answer to that is, when you're talking about people below the poverty line, really, I'm from India too, so I know that many people can't even afford generic drugs, and this is a sad reality of India. And India is one government of India, I would say, both the central government and the state governments put together, they are spending very little money on the health sector in India. This is a criticism that has been made by public health activists of India in particular, where you find less than 2%. It's really 1 point something percent of GDP that is spent on the health sector in India. So something needs to be done in order to help people to get access to medicines, particularly generic medicines, which are widely available otherwise for those who have higher incomes. Yes. There is, of course, the question of access to cancer medicines, in particular, which are extremely expensive, and where some of these medicines only are administered in hospital settings. So there the question is access not just to the medicine, but also to the hospital or the institution where such medicines can be administered, which is not, again, something that that is available to those below the poverty line. It does take time to type here. Is anybody typing? This I cannot see. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so if there are any other questions, I would be happy to answer. And these are just my views. You can take it with a pinch of salt and you can question them, of course. I would love to hear your views. So I have a question. As you know, Bangladesh will graduate from LDC status by 2021. In this background, how should Bangladesh address the matter? Now, Bangladesh obviously hopes to graduate from LDC status in 2021, and that's a very good thing. I think the government is doing a good thing to aim to change the status of Bangladesh from LDC. At the moment, Bangladesh is still an LDC and does not have to apply the TRIPS agreement, right? So this period, this transition period, which actually continues till July 2021 for all TRIPS provisions, but for pharmaceuticals in particular, extends to January 2033, is something that Bangladesh is already taking advantage of, as far as I know, and setting up, in fact, manufacturing facilities, increasing the setup of manufacturing facilities, particularly manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredients with the API park, for instance, near Dhaka. And I think that's a very good thing. And that's a very good thing to proceed to do that in order to make sure that all those products which are not on patents at the moment, where you can freely make those products in Bangladesh, will be made. There will be some products for which this is not going to work, but Bangladesh is making the right investments, I think, and should continue to do so on biotechnology products, on API, and so on. So Ujjwal Kumar is saying, it is said that enhancing quality of patents, stricter patentability criteria, can also reduce prices of certain medicines, particularly which are prone to evergreening. I agree. I agree that patent offices all around the world, whether developed or developing, should actually strictly apply the patentability criteria in a way that actually takes out products or inventions which shouldn't be patented. Now, whether you can then add criteria of patentability, which are not strictly criteria of patentability, is another matter. That's another debate that we can have on the legal issues. But certainly, when patents are refused for inventions which are not patentable, then it's a good thing. That's the way the TRIPS agreement should be applied everywhere. Now, what is your view on the recent Delhi High Court judgment excluding exports of patented products for obtaining regulatory approval? I haven't followed that, Aparna. I really don't know about that particular judgment. But there are many countries, including India, that actually do not require regulatory approvals when patented products, patent medicines in particular, are destined for export markets. That is not the case in Canada, as we know from their CAMR legislation, where they do actually require Health Canada to approve even export products under the compulsory licensing for exports. Do countries like India, or should other countries have 3D when it comes to patent evergreening? Is that what you're asking, Satish? Well, certainly there are some which have tried to copy the 3D either in patent guidelines or in amendments to the patent law or to patent examination guidelines, as I said, and others are free to do so. So far, there hasn't been a WTO dispute on this. That doesn't mean that all WTO members believe that 3D type of provisions are TRIPS compatible, but certainly no dispute has been raised in the WTO on this. We have another 6 minutes in case there are questions or comments. I would be happy to hear your views. Throw some light on the recent implementation of Article 31 bis. Ujjal, I'm not sure what you mean by recent implementation of 31 bis. It is now part of the TRIPS agreement. Since 2/3 of the WTO membership have accepted the protocol amending the TRIPS agreement, and we now have a new text of the TRIPS agreement which incorporates 31 bis as a new article, as well as an annex and an appendix to the annex in the TRIPS text. And a number of countries have implemented it in their national legislation, and that is available on the WTO website. You should actually look at the WTO website to see which are the countries that have implemented this in their national legislation, either as exporters or as potential importers. Why has there not been a compulsory license application in India after the first one several years ago? I really don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone in the audience can explain this, because I am not really familiar with why there hasn't been one. Aparna. There was one by BDR for dasatinib. This is the compulsory license application. But I believe it was rejected because BDR had not taken proper steps to negotiate a license. So this is what Aparna says. Thank you, Aparna. Yes, I'm aware of that, says R. Thanks. Good. Satish says, maybe for the reason all the brand owner companies reasonably provide medicines at affordable prices and manufacture in India? Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. Is that your opinion, Satish? I know there's a lot of patent opposition. So wherever there's patent oppositions and the patentability criteria are not met, India is strictly following that and rejecting, in addition to 3D type. So someone else has said, well, affordable price, not at all. Okay. I do believe that we should all be thinking about how we can make non-market based models of R&D work actually in practice, and also how we can make differential pricing, which is really a win-win situation for both the originators and the patients. How can we make these work? What are the conditions we need to agree to internationally for this to work? This is something that we should all be reflecting on. So do we need changes to the pre-grant and post-grant opposition process? I presume, Nagraj, you mean in India, and I'm not really familiar with the provisions and the processes. They seem to be working well as far as I can see. So I'm not really an expert to answer that question. Thank you, nevertheless, for the questions. All of you, thank you very much for your questions and for your patience in listening to this webinar. I think I've enjoyed it. I hope you have enjoyed it too. And if anybody wants to be in touch with me and continue this conversation, you are free to email me. My email addresses are quite freely available on the web, I think. Many of you know that. So After LDC graduation, how long Bangladesh will get benefits in pharmaceuticals? Well, you have. If you graduate from LDCs, I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to be immediate that you will no longer get LDC benefits. Once graduation kicks in, the effective date of graduation. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you for the nice comments you've made and the very interesting questions. I've enjoyed it a lot, and let's be in touch. Thank you. We go off air now.